Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? You guys still doing okay? I know it's been quite a long day. So we've got one more workshop, and then we'll have the closing keynotes, which should be down at 5. So we're going to try and do our best to finish on time, so you can get downstairs and get a good seat to see the rest of the keynote. So I want to welcome everyone to the session Food Wars in Africa, which is a workshop on food security and conflict in Somalia, Mali, and beyond. And so my name is Michael Conway. I'm a student here, candidate for public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali for 2 years, so I have a particular interest in this topic, and I'm very eager to hear what our speakers have to say. Joining us today is Will Masters, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Food and Nutrition Policy at the Friedman School of Nutrition over at Tufts University. His research focuses on economics of agricultural and nutrition in rural Africa. And prior to coming to Tufts, he spent nearly 20 years as a faculty member in agricultural economics at Purdue University, as well as the University of Zimbabwe, here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and also at Columbia. While here at HKS, Professor Masters worked at the Center for International Development on the role of agricultural and economic development, and he also edited the Journal of the Association of Agricultural Economists. And in 2010, he was named an International Fellow of the African Association of Agricultural Economists. And next we have Professor Ishak Diwan, who's a lecturer of public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School and director for Africa and the Middle East of the Growth Lab at the Center for International Development. In addition, Professor Diwan directs the Economic and Political Transformation Program of the Economic Research Forum, and he's worked at the World Bank's Middle East Department as the country economist for the West Bank and Gaza, as an advisor to the emerging Palestinian Authority, and a regional economist. He's also led the World Bank's Economic Policy Group and served as the bank's country director for Ethiopia, Sudan, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. He has worked on conflict prevention and state building in both Middle East and Africa, and participated in the Sudan Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005, the Darfur peace negotiations, and the Oslo negotiations. Needless to say, our panelists know exactly what they're talking about. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our two guests, and then we'll let them go ahead and get started. So thank you. Please.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Mike. So we're here because Mike and Anjali and other organizers at a little bit the 11th hour kind of looked at the program and said, there's no food here, there's no agriculture, there's no poverty as in terms of the livelihoods of the great majority of the world. And this being, at the Kennedy School, it seemed appropriate to frame any discussion of this in terms of the sort of macro political conflict and diplomacy implications of food and agriculture. So that's what we want to talk about, is the degree to which wars might be food wars. So, some time ago it became popular to say that wars of the 20th century were about oil, wars of the 21st century would be about water. That was the sort of very, sort of trendy thing to say. And water is mostly for food. And to some degree, perhaps 21st century wars are about food. As you'll see, very sharp run-up in the price of food in recent years. This shows you the run-up in the price since 2004. Paper that got a fair bit of press showing how when food prices are pretty high, and particularly when there are recent spikes, there are riots in the streets in a lot of vulnerable, politically vulnerable countries where a regime might be unpopular for one reason or another. People go on the street with a grievance against the government with respect to food. There are, in parentheses here, the number of deaths, and quite a number of governments toppled due to these food riots, most notably perhaps the Arab Spring associated with this spike in food prices that you see here, and a sense of vulnerability associated with a sense of vulnerability about food. Food riots in the street where people have a grievance about food, well, that's specifically connected to food. More generally, civil conflicts where people take up arms and we have an actual insurrection, that was recently correlated to agriculture in this nice paper in Nature associated with the food price spike that we just saw. People using these data to correlate them with lots of stuff. This paper correlates climate events that are known to harm agriculture. The ENSO El Nino effect, in vulnerable countries, the temperature anomaly of El Nino being clearly associated with more frequent civil conflicts, active insurrections, and this is the sort of money quote. Right? It's clear that the way agricultural economists like to say this is that high food prices have predicted several hundred of the last dozen food riots. So there are lots of instances of high food prices and food price spikes that don't lead to, and all you need basically is adequate incomes, some coping mechanisms, some safety nets to avoid. And the same, if people are not living in rural poverty, climate change is much, much, much less important. But it really helps. So there is a vulnerability effect here. So what I want to do is just frame quickly that vulnerability in terms of the role of climate in agriculture and food in recent conflicts. We'll start with the big headline ones recently and then look more broadly. So this is the Somalia famine. If you were paying attention, you knew that there was a famine declared very recently in Somalia. This picture shows you the wages earned by unskilled workers in southern Somalia, the region of the famine. On the green line, the cereal price for maize in Somali shilling, and the ratio of the two on the right-hand axis in the red. So that's the purchasing power. The ratio of the two is the purchasing power of labor in terms of food. And what you see is this is a drought-prone region. Things got bad, and things were bad and got worse in 2010. And people in desperation turned to increasing efforts to find off-farm work, and wages fall. This is the Sen hypothesis that famines are fundamentally caused by deprivation, not by food scarcity. Right? So people are increasingly poor, and that's what makes them vulnerable. At the same time, food did, in fact, in this region, become increasingly scarce. And what was going on was that the usual coping strategies that these vulnerable people have, which is to go and work off-farm, became increasingly impossible. And livestock sales, the price of livestock became extremely low. Their ability to sell, these agropastoralists, of course, in semi-nomadic environments, selling their livestock when times are bad. Those coping mechanisms were exhausted, and the Al-Shabaab militias prevented the normal migration patterns that might have helped people to escape. And remittances were disrupted by US sanctions against Al-Shabaab. So the Somali diaspora was unable to help these individuals to survive. Famine was declared by the criteria used by the UN. There was a set of triggering a set of responses that did help considerably, and better harvests led to the end of famine. So that's the timeline of what happened in the Somali headline. What's now in the headlines is Mali. So this is just a really recent kind of flash effect of simmering vulnerability that we'll talk, I think, later in discussion to the extent people want to focus on this conflict in particular, but it's an unfolding drama as we speak. There was a coup d'etat about 3 weeks ago that was immediately responded to by the international community with sanctions that proved to be very effective. And the coup makers chose to initiate a transition right away, but the rebel groups against which the coup makers had been fighting declared northern Mali to be an independent Tuareg government, and that is now the center of the conflict, with the numbers of internally displaced people you see here, the numbers of international migrants you see here, a humanitarian catastrophe, although not yet declared. So I want to just set this stuff in context real quickly for you, because it's really, really helpful to kind of take a look at this up close, carefully, in terms of human rights and the humanitarian disaster that these numbers represent. But go up in a balloon and just keep going up to 30,000 feet and look at Africa as a whole across countries. As best we have data from about welfare, one of the best things to measure is whether children are underweight. Families try to feed infants before almost anything else. And we see many, many African countries having significant improvements in the recent years, except for some exceptions. So here is the Somalia exception. Prior to the famine, that vulnerability that made the situation ignite when things suddenly got even worse. Elsewhere in Africa, you have a similar situation with widespread improvements, except in the region around Mali. So we don't have these surveys from Mali itself. These data come from Niger. So all this is, of course, preceding. So the point is that if you think about this in recent historical terms, Africa's extreme vulnerability is a really recent phenomenon. It happened when I was already in my 20s. It happened, when students today were born. Prior to that, it was East Asia, right? This is primarily Chinese extreme poverty due to the extraordinary oppressive nature of the Maoist regime that was finally lifted with the household responsibility system and so forth, beginning in 1981, and that led to the world's greatest poverty reductions in China, elsewhere in East Asia as well, South Asia emerging from poverty, as you see here, a bit more slowly, Africa having no progress or perhaps some further impoverishment, becoming the center of world impoverishment in this recent mid-90s period. But then some perhaps significant, the trends are not yet clear, but some perhaps significant reduction. So I want to put that in context. One of the things that happened in Africa was it became a continent of children. And children are really expensive in terms of household resources having to be kept at home, in terms of the stress on the community of schooling and so forth. All of the world's developing countries had an increasing child dependency rate, but Africa had a really increasing child dependency rate, with up to close to half of all people under 15. That's an extraordinary burden, known as kind of child, known as the demographic burden, the child dependency burden, that was worse in Africa than anywhere else in the world. But that dependency burden is gradually falling. So that helps to explain the reduction in poverty in recent years. This is nowhere worse than in rural areas. So this is the growth rate of rural population in Asia and Africa having been similarly high until it wasn't anymore. And Africa became the region of the world with the world's fastest rural population. That also is getting less bad and helps to explain the emergence from poverty of African countries now and the reduced vulnerability everywhere except the Horn of Africa, including Somalia, and the Sahel, including Mali. Eventually, you get to something like this, where rural population growth falls below zero. There's still total population growth. Where are all those people? They're going to cities. So Africa's cities have actually been growing as fast or faster than cities anywhere in the world for a very long time. They're just still really small, because at independence, they were really small. African cities were extremely stunted by colonialism and slavery and other things, but the history of export and other things that led Africans to not urbanize in the same rate as Asians and others. But land per farmer can't increase until you can draw your rural population down below the zero line. And that's not going to happen in Africa for quite a long time, but nonetheless, this decline in rural population growth rates is a reduced headwind that makes it people much less vulnerable to a climate shock occurring. How can you cope with reduced area of land? Well, the thing to do is to plant better seeds that will lead to farmers being able to have higher yields. You can't have higher yields unless something changes, and that something is most fundamentally the genetics of the seed. That's something outsiders have to do for you, because you can't develop you can't change the genetic blueprint of a plant yourself. It comes from crossing plants of that species that have developed under other conditions with other traits, crossing again until you find what works for you. That wasn't done for Africa until the 1990s. So independence, of course, only came in the 1960s. That was done first in Asia, the Green Revolution. There was no Green Revolution for Africa because Africa didn't need it back then. It was not the poorest region. So Africa's Green Revolution is something like 20 years behind. So that lays the kind of contextual, numerical, 30,000 foot context for the famine in Somalia, the crisis in Mali. And I think a lot of the understanding of poverty and vulnerability to conflict that we would want to think about in terms of the diplomacy of response and the opportunities for intervention to avoid the worst and perhaps enable the best outcomes from a bad situation that's getting better, but getting better slowly. Africa is not yet out of the woods. I'll just flash up a few kind of concluding ideas here. Africa had the most extreme demographic difficulties. Africa is now having those difficulties abate. That is, the headwind is getting less severe, the burden is getting lighter. The circumstances continue to be the hardest in the world in terms of households, communities trying to reduce their vulnerability. The difficulty is greater in Africa than anywhere else. And I would emphasize that. So, in order to look from the 30,000 foot level and see the big picture, you do need to squint and make everything a little fuzzy. When you zoom back in, you recognize this kind of diversity again and need to recontextualize. And having zoomed out, you need to zoom back in, and that's what I hope we can do in this discussion.
Great, I'll try to follow up. I thought that I wouldn't do PowerPoints for a change. Just talk to you a little bit about my experiences when I was country director for the World Bank based in Ethiopia, covering Ethiopia and Sudan. And because I think there were two stories there that you could contrast in a very interesting way about the impact of food scarcity. And these are the drought in Ethiopia in 2003 was a massive drought and what it led to. And on the other hand, the difficulties in Darfur that escalated into a terrible civil war that really fragmented and turned most of the population into refugee camps and destroyed most livelihood in Darfur. You wonder how this place could ever be put back in shape, really. And I think this illustrates in many ways the difficulties of societies to adapt to food insecurity when they're vulnerable. And surely these are in kind of the remaining countries that we're talking about, two of the most vulnerable ones. In Ethiopia, because of very high population density in the highlands, people try to escape the sicknesses of the lowland, and the population increase has happened very much in the highland. And in parts of the highland, eastern part, the environment is very fragile and has been degraded very fast by this overpopulation, leading to a series of droughts and famines over the years. The one in 2003 was particularly hard. There were about 15 million people that couldn't feed themselves that year. And at that time, the government and the various donors and international partners woke up and thought, it's not just a case of bringing food. This is really a national threat. This is a fragile country that could be destroyed if that kind of phenomenon is allowed to continue. So why don't we put our heads together and think not just of bringing food, but of more sustainable solution? Because actually bringing food adds to unsustainability. You just allow people to stay and to become more immersed in areas that cannot sustain them, and the next crisis will be even worse. So what came out of that is an initiative which got called something like the Initiative to Fight Hunger or so, where donors committed that or pledged the expected food money over 5 years, but in one shot, so that the government of Ethiopia knew that they can count on pretty large resources to put together a multi-year plan where instead of giving food for consumption, food was organized as part of the system to rehabilitate the environment. And so it was paid as wages as part of what got called the productive safety net, whose goal was to build public assets to basically bring back nature, reinvigorate nature, bring back forest and water by terracing the mountains, by planting trees to retain earth and the like. And that was supplemented by government program to actually support households directly with packages, whether in agriculture or non-agriculture, that would allow them to escape from the poverty trap and to be able to think ahead and plan and invest for the future. Right now, 6-7 million people are part of this program every year. It's been going on for 5 years. The results are extremely encouraging, and I think this program is basically making a dent in that, in solving this old problem. And I think that the lesson here is that good governance, strong government program, coordination with the donors can make a difference. And Ethiopia in 2003 was at that moment in its history, which is a difficult history, but at that lucky moment where such an action was possible and where big results hopefully would show up. Now contrast that with the case of Darfur. Darfur erupted in civil war while in the early 2000s, while historically it's a place where I think 65 or 70 different linguistic groups, that's part of your 1,500, so that's a whole lot. And if you think also next to Darfur, the Nuba mountain area where there's another 40, 50 groups as well, have been living very harmoniously for centuries actually. In the traditional system, where there was a kingdom, the Darfur, the house of the four, the Dar is an arrangement where the king, through what is called the Hakura system, manages to establish contracts with various groups. It's very much in the center of Africa, so there are groups that move for various reasons, and actually the kingdom of Darfur was trying to attract them to settle in the Darfur because of the need for labor, but under a system where there's a contract about how they relate to each other, how they deal with the environment, how conflicts are resolved as well. And some of those groups are settler groups, others are nomadic groups. So there was also quite a symbiotic relation between nomads and settlers. The nomads taking the livestock of the settlers and moving it around and using the manure on the field and the like. I don't want to make that sound too parallel this yet, but nevertheless, that system actually collapsed. So it's true that the immediate reason for the problem in Darfur is the environmental degradation and the crisis over resources. And it is due in reality to the expansion of the population in Darfur over the years, in the 19th century. The fact that there was no increase in yields, and therefore agriculture expanded very much geographically, occupied more and more land. The government in Khartoum encouraged the mechanization of agriculture in Darfur and the Duma Mountains. So you had large tracts of land acquired from the government because the new land law actually nationalized all land, became government's property, could be sold to investors. And all this expansion complicated enormously the movements of the nomadic people, creating tension. Now, those tensions wouldn't necessarily lead to a civil war if it wasn't for the fact that the old system wasn't replaced by anything. Actually, Darfur used to be the center of Sudan in the past, but after the state grew around Khartoum and it became a very centralized state with everything else, including Darfur, the Noor Mountains, the south of Sudan, exploited and on the periphery, very badly governed, no development spending. So nothing replaced the old system. Nothing replaced the old governance system. There were administrators sent from Khartoum that had no clue about how to solve conflicts. And there were no development efforts to replace the old livelihood with something new. So really it's the combination of increasing population and the beginning of tension between various groups and the lack of governance and the lack of good policies that created this conflict. Now, add to that, I'll add that because it's relevant, I think, for Mali. Add to that the actual militarization of the region. On the one hand, Gaddafi had created the Islamic Legion, bringing in one of the major groups, the Zagawas, to fight in Chad for regime change. And on the other, and later on, in the fight against the SPLA, the Southern Sudanese Liberation Army, the government in Khartoum armed the Arab tribes in order to counter the SPLA. Those were the nomads. And so now you have several groups that were armed, and that conflict over resources became an armed conflict. Interesting also how these 65 plus 50, all these different groups suddenly became Arab and African. The recipients, if you like, of ideologies arriving from afar to the region and dividing the people. I mean, everybody there is Muslim and it's not clear how groups decide to be Africans or Arabs, very much in relation to external supporters and to conflicts that come to them from the outside. So basically, I think that contrast is interesting, making us think about the complexity of these situations and the fact that conflict over resources is very much at the center. That's what gets things going. But the history, the nature of power, the way development policies are or are not put together is really what makes a difference in finding sustainable solutions. Thank you.
So I think we're in about 20 minutes, but the reason we brought this together is because the situation in Mali was unfolding very recently, and we thought that this was a very relevant topic to talk about at the International Development Conference. And so I think it probably attracted a lot of people who have specific interests. And so in wanting to give you guys a chance to ask specific questions to your particular interest, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor to whatever kinds of things you guys want to ask. And if you don't need the mic, then feel free to just...
I'm Sam Lowenberg. I'm a journalist and cover hunger crises and have covered crisis in the Sahel and written about the Horn of Africa as well. And I wanted to ask you both if you could talk actually about non-conflict areas. I'm thinking and the responsibilities of national governments. I'm thinking specifically about Kenya and Ethiopia. Last year we had the hunger crisis that affected, as everyone heard, 4 million people in Somalia, but it was also 5 million in Ethiopia and 4 million in Kenya. Those are two places without any conflict. And there was, what I was told by people when I was there was that, the national governments have a lot of responsibility here too. That there's a lot of underdevelopment in Ethiopia with the livelihoods programs. There was talk about corruption and political favoritism, and areas being ignored because they weren't with the ruling party. In Kenya, I was told by a regional governor, we asked for assistance for 66% of our population. We only got assistance for a third. They didn't even take a nutrition survey until very close to the summer, and that there was a lot of failures on that front, and that basically these areas where they had these big hunger crises had been very underdeveloped for a long time, and that wasn't happening. So I wondered if you could address that issue.
I mean, you have to keep in mind that I'll speak about Ethiopia first. Ethiopia is an extremely poor country where GDP per capita, when I was there, it was $100. I think now it's closer to $200. And so public expenditures per capita is, say, $30, $40. And you have to buy health and education and water and roads, everything for that. Now, from what I know, this is pretty fairly distributed around the country. And this is the predicament of the place. It's so thinly spread that you get very little investment. Unless actually it is possible to concentrate investments in some corridors, it's very hard to get some return. But yet, the way Ethiopia is organized as a federal state with intergovernmental transfer that go down all the way to the village level, it gets extremely thinly divided. And so the results are slow, even though they've been actually quite remarkable in the past 10 years or so. It's one of the few countries where the millennium goals, or many of them, are going to be met. So I can't say much more than that. It's a country that's overly politicized, and you will always have accusations of the type that you've said. And I don't know the specifics of that particular accusation, but I tend to discount.
It was a big BBC report last year.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know the particulars. What I'm saying is I don't think that some regions are utterly kind of left aside. That's not the way the system works. Now, last year was a particularly bad drought from what I hear, and some extra support was needed. There were lots of controversies about how much support is needed, and the government, because of their war on poverty, war on hunger rather, that I described earlier, and their attempt to graduate people out of the safety net, was trying to minimize their estimates. And on the other hand, donors feel very righteous, and many of them are, this business is their livelihood, and they try to exaggerate as well. And so the truth probably is somewhere in between.
That is a good question to spend a little more time on rather than sort of, because both of these are countries that whose governments commit, very, very serious sins, right? So Ethiopia, to characterize, would be an ethno state in which they balkanize the country along ethnic lines, and that has led to this kind of story that you see. Kenya, more of a kleptocracy, right, in which corruption is the sin that people focus on. But both countries do very interesting things right. I think Ethiopia is most justly known for being a successful safety net country. The productive safety net program has shown the power of the dole, of having the employment guarantee style of food for work or guaranteed wage, so that when people fall below the opportunity to work in their own agriculture, agropastoral work, and so forth, they can turn to the public works and do something that's going to get paid for that. What Ethiopia hasn't had is, and what Kenya has done, Kenya doesn't have that kind of safety net in place, but what Kenya has done is just extraordinary agricultural productivity, right? So Kenya has successfully introduced actual modern seed varieties. Wow. Ethiopians, most of them, are still planting their great going back, grandparent seed varieties, because the government didn't think seeds were very important, and continued to have a government monopoly, have control over seed supply. Kenya, has the autocracy problem, the lack of a safety net problem, and other things, but they do have. So that is part of the reason why, in the face of the same climate shocks, they stumbled but did not fall into the famine condition that Somalia would perhaps have escaped outright famine if it hadn't been for the armed conflicts of the Shabab insurgency and the remittances cut. But that just goes to show to the degree to which it takes both sides of the scissors to actually cut people's livelihoods off.
If I could just throw a very quick thing out, when in both countries, people told me over and over the big problem was water. And when I asked I was speaking to the deputy health minister in Ethiopia, and I said, why don't you guys do more on water? I've been hearing about that from everybody. I've been seeing community workers and health posts and blah, blah, blah. But everyone says water, water, water. And he says, oh, that's the water ministry. They're down the road. That's not us. That's not a health thing.
Can you hear me now? Yes. My name is I'm a practitioner. I live and work part-time in rural Kenya, Ethiopia, and I used to live in northern Burkina Faso. And so I've worked with a number of these ethnic groups. What's kind of scaring me a bit, and having been in these areas, and especially with agro-pastoralists, is the rise of foreign commercial farming. And so I'd just like you to both address it, please.
Yeah, that's a hugely important, very interesting question. So the drama of agriculture is that it's what poor people do. It's where the poor come from. They might emerge out of poverty. They emerge out of rural poverty. They emerge out of farming. They're farming because they have no other choice. They're going to cities as fast as they possibly can. So farmers are poor. And rich people are like, well, I could do better than that. And without much doubt, it's clear that if one could bring a lot of capital to agriculture, you could step it up and have African farmers be more like Asian farmers, and Asian farmers more like Latin American, and so on and so forth. Now, the drama is that agriculture is pretty much everywhere, and for pretty much all crops, not all livestock, but all crops, a family business. And it's a family business because you can't supervise workers, like for real, you can't. They have to be self-motivated. And so that's why over the centuries, literally centuries, even millennia, back to the Romans and so forth, an attempt to have richer people go to poorer places and say, I'll own this agriculture, has always failed. Investor-owned agriculture has failed over and over again. Two things are amazing about that. One, that it's failed over and over again, and secondly, that people have tried over and over again, despite those failures. So, so it's pretty clear that the drama of investor-owned, the drama of the land grab, the foreign investor, is only partly that they're foreign. It's mostly just that they're investors. There's an attempt by a rich guy or rich woman to say, I can do this better than you, which necessarily involves some employed workers. So it's pretty clear from the history that this will end in tears, with workers rebelling, with the ownership rights of the you know, of course there's a lot of code of conduct background and so forth. The land that was supposedly leased has been ripped off from the indigenous people. The transparency involved is nil, and the side payments and corruption are awful, and so on and so forth. But below that is a deeper thing, which is it's a doomed enterprise from the start, with some few notable exceptions. So you want to remember that there are, of course, some exceptions of investor-owned agriculture that do succeed, and pay attention to those, because those could succeed. So tea plantations, sugar plantations, livestock enterprises, and so forth. But there certainly are big opportunities for foreign investors to help move agriculture forward, principally in the input supply, also in processing and marketing, and getting those to interface well with this household sector of family farm. That's the drama of agricultural institutions, where the public sector really matters, and so much of the World Bank, was and is justly focused on that.
Perhaps I'd add something. I mean, the fact that agricultural and commodity prices are expected to be high for the foreseeable future because of these demand and S-curves, if you like, from China and India, because of the rising world, is a great opportunity for Africa. I mean, agriculture can be both. Now, of course, it could be also a curse, but the real question is how to turn this opportunity into energy for development. And I think that's a very, very central and important question. And the answers are not easy. They vary per country and per type of system and per crop. And I myself don't think that there's a general answer to say commercial agriculture is bad or small is always good. There's really a panoply of instruments that go from new types of outgrower schemes to investment up in the value chain, from processors that can buy and provide the right incentives, all the way to, in some cases, plantation with workers, to, in some cases, I've seen some good marketing boards in Burkina, for example, for cotton, or in Ghana for cocoa. There's really a panoply of instruments, and really the challenge for the future is going to see countries figuring out with investors their strategies, and not just ending up in curves. And I think most countries are in much better shape than in the 70s, and this isn't as bad, as corrupting as oil. So I'm actually quite hopeful that this coming boom is going to make a difference.
I think we have about 10 minutes left, so why don't we take 3 more questions, and then we'll let you guys sort of address the low-hanging fruit from that. So I think back here, one more, and anybody else? Go ahead.
I just had a question in regards to communities whose agricultural norms have been disrupted by insecurity, and so taking into account several years of conflict with the IDPs, the returnees, and all of these things. How, in your opinion, have you guys seen communities come back to agricultural norms after that? I work in, just contextually, I work in the northeastern DRC, and right now we're seeing a lot of the Lord's Resistance Army and those things kind of fall by the wayside, and we're having issues with communities getting back into their normal agricultural practices. And so we're still seeing food insecurity, even though the primary cause for their food insecurity is land. I don't know.
Okay, and then there was one.
There's,
I was going to say
Take 3, right?
Hi, I'm Whitney from Conscious today. I have a question that's kind of along the lines, I think Professor Juan, you ended your talk talking about how food policy, I'm guessing from the government level is what you're discussing, can provide food for the future. But then what Professor Masters was talking about as far as this kind of family tradition of farming. In the example of Kenya, where the Kenyatta family has predominantly owned most of the farming for like sisal and coffee and the milk industry. What can you say when there's difficulty of interest with it when the government is associated with these private farming practices and kind of dominates the food economy in that regard? So like how do you develop a policy with the government with that?
one more. Back behind.
Yes, Brandon Boyle, work with a nonprofit, International Development Group. Can you list the top 3 things, or top few things? Can you list the top? Can you list the top 2 or 3 things that a nonprofit international development organization might do to help smallholder farmers, medium-sized farmers in developing countries in a post-conflict situation around helping them provide food security for their region?
Good. So that last question is actually very similar to the very difficult question of people returning from after a period of displacement. And I think there are some success stories. When you think of what was done in Rwanda, what was done elsewhere, I think the crucial things are, on one hand, in terms of institutions and social frameworks, the security and the property rights to establish again, who's who and who's entitled to what, and then in terms of technology, to have as quickly as possible the input packs, the seeds, the hose, and so forth, to rebuild what is, something like, so the total value of capital that typical household would have accumulated after generations of farming in Africa might be, $200 worth of stuff. So that is entirely affordable to a major post-conflict program. To just say, look, we'll stake you to this, and we will make an effort to have the right seed varieties. We will make an effort to have the right implements. And if you have that institutional framework of the titles and so forth, you deserve at least this. And not to try to make this some kind of private sector opportunity. I think that's the crucial lesson from both. And I do want to say regarding the story of the Kenyatta family or other instances where a ruling family has a major stake in agriculture, although make no mistake, you remember one thing from this session, it's that those very large farms, that the affluent farmer of course is themselves affluent, but they are lower in productivity per unit of labor, per unit of land than a smallholder regime would be. Okay, so the person is affluent, but the overall productivity is much lower than if it was divided up into smallholder, low-income parcels. But having an elite that actually engages in farming is the reason why Kenya has invested in agricultural productivity growth, why the Ivarian miracle under Hufwekwanyi occurred, because he himself had a stake in it, and so on and so forth, why Suharto in Indonesia did, and so forth. So having an agriculturally rooted elite has made a big difference. The most extreme example of this is white Zimbabweans, who were one of the few agrarian states where you had democracy among farmers. Of course, it was only white farmers, and they were ruthless in the extreme, but they did generate the second in the world and the first in Africa hybrid maize program, the most productive agricultural innovation system in all of Africa by far, more productive than South Africa's, because they were an agrarian state of elite landowners. Their individual farms would have been more productive. They've been cut up into family operations, but because they were able to provide the public goods that agriculture needs, and elites that don't have their feet in agriculture don't do that. And so the rural poor remain poor and so forth. That's a large part of the difference between Kenya and Ethiopia. Can be traced to the fact that the Ethiopian elites have no interest in agriculture.
So I just discovered we actually have 20 more minutes, so it's a bombshell revelation. I actually wanted to ask a question. So we've been talking about some of the structural problems around the food security issues in these countries, but right now we have Mali, which is at a critical juncture with their particular crisis. And so just to give some backdrop, we have a Tuareg state that has been declared in the country, which consists of about 1 million people, where there's also, incidentally, a food security crisis happening, and those two things very interrelated. We have a coup that is sort of also related, and recently has been, the democratic institutions have been reinstated. In the short term, given the upcoming hot season, the upcoming hot season and hunger season, what should political institutions be focusing on right now? And what do you think are the sort of key things to care about in the coming months as opposed to sort of the long term.
I was just checking at what time we finished. Because I thought it was 5.
So, yeah.
I have an appointment at 5.
Because it's such a difficult question. I think I have an universities are wonderful things. Universities are really amazing things because we have specialists. So there is in town the Feinstein International Center across the street from the Fletcher School does have experts on this very issue, of which I am not one. I would just say one thing in terms of what the Mali story and the Somalia story suggest is a pretty prescient aspect of the work of Paul Collier, who, in writing his book, The Bottom Billion, suggested that one of the most important development interventions of the 21st century would be the security interventions, where we would make the displaced person migration response, the remittances, the markets, and so forth possible by saying, no, you can't have militia-controlled territory and so forth. So I would imagine that a security response has to be a big part of the appropriate development response to have a robust military intervention at this point, and not to simply accept that might be threatened.
I mean, perhaps I can add broader perspective, the regional perspective. The Sahelian corridor is very good. On the one hand, you have desertification, and you have these conflicts in sedentary and nomadic people. And on the other, you have most countries have this north-south fracture that you go from all the way from Somalia to Mali and then beyond to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And it's just the way these countries have been built, north-south, from a fertile, cut from fertile south to the limits of North Africa in the north is very problematic. Now, of course, there is this principle with the African Union not to reopen border issues, but increasingly there are pressures, whether from Somalia or now from Mali, to do so. And the answer is not obvious. Today the problem is in Mali, and the EU has sanctions, and it's going to be hard for that particular devil to go back in the box, because, as you're saying, 1 million people for a huge territory, they have lots of weapons that came back from Libya. It's not going to be easy to dislodge. At the same time, there are contagion effects all the way to Algeria. The Tuareg issue, somewhat smaller way, is a bit like the Turkish issue. This is a large group of people divided between 4 or 5 countries, actually. There are even some affiliations all the way with Zagawas in Chad that we were, and Darfur we were talking about before. So this is potentially the beginning of a very complex problem. That plus you have the Qaeda issue that, on the ideological side, on the money side, that's trying to develop somewhere, and that's potentially a good territory for that. So I think this is the beginning of a very large conflict that will stay with us for a while. And there are no obvious solutions given the way structures for conflict resolution are right now. We want to dream of some kind of an international force that can do good and that will go and do what? I mean, like a mandate over that region. It's really hard these days to think of a solution, but it's increasingly important.
Well, I mean, on the Sahel crisis, other than the current political chaos in Mali, that this is, I think, the 4th time in the last decade that the region has had a very, very serious hunger crisis, tens of millions of people. I've written about it 4 times, I think, since 2005. This current one was, and in most of these countries, there's not any political conflict. Niger, for instance, and this was warned about by FuseNet, the Family Early Warning System, part of USAID, back in November. They said there's going to be a serious food insecurity here, above average because of climate. So we knew this was coming. It's gotten worse in Mali, and it's more difficult to do something about right now. But in the whole region, this is a chronic problem. And with this much notice ahead of time, isn't there something that we could be doing besides delivering emergency food aid, which is where most of our money is going? And what are those specific things?
Like what? I mean, crisis is a crisis. You can't feed the people. You're not going to.
Well, what about water harvesting, for instance? We put very, very little money into water, into sanitation, into infrastructure, into roads, into keeping markets going. All sorts
Well,
of
that's
things
exactly
like that.
the point. One has to look for much more sustainable solutions. But much more sustainable solutions require also that you focus on governance, because that's really the heart of it. And then that's why those political issues, I think, in the Sahelian and with the Tuareg are so important, because what really got things off is the movement of weapons and that revolt that has destroyed suddenly, what used to be perceived as a stable democracy has been there for what, 15 years or so. It's quite dramatic.
But they already had very severe hunger problems for a long time before this involved. This is the thing that that broke the camel's back, I guess. But it seems to me that the underlying poverty and the weak infrastructure is the thing that doesn't really ever get addressed.
Yeah. So first of all, the issue of these borders being arbitrary in the way you described, most memorably the French described the country of Chad as being composed of a part that was Chad Uti and the part that was Chad Inuti. But the borders have that sin of creating these countries that aren't really countries in the ethnic or coherent geographic sense. They also had, crucially, the problem of limiting out migration. So the historic remedy to being in a Sahel-type region, which was a very attractive place to be in the 14th century, and maybe not so afterwards, and people moving into the high plateau areas to escape disease and so forth, and then getting stuck there. The historical remedy to that, whether you think of, Southern Europe, the emigration out of Italy and Greece, or Scandinavia, the immigration out of Norway and Sweden, the remedy is out-migration. And the real original sin here is trapping people in an awful place. Now, conditional on trapping people in an awful place and saying, no, you can't move to Paris and no, you can't move to the United States, so first of all, we shouldn't simply accept that as given. That's just not okay. But if you're going to trap people in an awful place, at least you can provide them with the tools to earn a livelihood. And here, trying to make Sahel a more moisture-rich environment is possible. But what we know we can do, what we used to know we can do but forgot we could do, is make plants do almost anything you want them to. You can breed for drought conditions. You can get yields up from what farmers are getting now, which is like 200 kgs a hectare, up to 300 kgs a hectare, even under the rainfall they have. You just have to breed for it. You have to pay breeders to do it, and to do it in that place. So that's job one, is breeding for local conditions. And then you bring in the fertilizer and so forth, and that's what makes roads worthwhile.
And there's also very little water storage. I know enough, like in Kenya, people said, yeah, we have a rainy season, it rains, we lose 90% of our water. We have nothing to store the water.
You can do some things to make moisture-stressed environment less moisture-stressed, but it's enormously expensive. It's akin to the remedy of infrastructure and roads, which is, so the remedy of bringing water to a water-stressed place is akin to the idea of bringing infrastructure to a very isolated place, which is, it would be great if you could do it, but it's vastly over the budget envelope of the public, the donors, philanthropists, plus national development. So it's really out of reach. In contrast, agricultural innovation in the sense of crop breeding plus agronomy is entirely affordable. It's just totally unfashionable because we don't need it here, so we don't we don't think it's an issue. There's enough food in total, as if anybody was going to give it to them. So we don't do it. So it's entirely affordable. It's the one degree of freedom that the international system actually has, is whether or not crop breeding is done for the location where people are traveling. And that has been done in some parts of Africa. It was done in very large parts of Asia. And it just has not yet been done for the majority of Africans who are still planting their great, going back forever, grandparents' pride. It's just a stunning deprivation that they have, deprived of modern science, in a way that is really stunning if you think about it.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Mary Beth Black, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. I find the entire discussion of food security a really disheartening discussion because I see three competing problems. You have the first problem being that you have continued droughts that come every year, every other year, every 5 years, and require substantial assistance and really quick fixes in order to alleviate the hunger of thousands or millions of people. Number two, you also are trying to find short, medium-term solutions, right? You're trying to find these ways to collect water, ways in which to adapt farming techniques, and you're trying to invest in that. And then number three, we're also talking about global climate change. And how do we address this huge issue of actually changing the ways in which we go about the carbon emissions and things like that on a global scale, because even if we address this short and medium term, we're going to continue to have increased temperatures. A 2 degree temperature increase in the Sahel is going to create massive problems for millions of people. So I think I would just like to hear your comments on the way forward. Where do we put our interests? It's really hard to take these three very, very difficult pieces and to put substantial aid behind all of them. So what do you say the best path is for moving forward? Thank you.
I think you summarized it very well. That is the agenda. I mean, all the parts, three parts, are important. Unless you can provide some security, people cannot think long term and invest. You don't invest in the tree if you think the tree has a very high probability of dying tomorrow. So you need the safety net. And as many of you have said here, you need the long-term investment. Otherwise, this is not going anywhere. But also you have to keep in mind the costs, and migration is part of the solution. So I mean, this is what Grant Richard calls a wiki hard problem. This is the hardest problem. We're talking of the least desirable, the hardest places on Earth, and how do you deal with those places? So they would also require a higher investment. Now, climate change you can also think about as an opportunity to the extent that the financing system is being put in place and internationally, and to the extent that that financing can then help develop technologies and energy in particular that would be sustainable. I mean, water technologies could receive large subsidies from the kind of fund that's being put together. A lot of water resources are not really taken advantage of in Africa. You could imagine lots of dams and lots of hydro and lots of irrigation. That costs a fortune, but to the extent that this would economize the world some carbon emissions in the future, it becomes much more affordable. So I think of the last one as partly an opportunity.
I don't know how much time we have, but maybe this might be the last question.
Yeah,
but I think it's really, really disappointing to me personally that you would see it as disheartening in the following sense. So virtually the entire world is as malnourished as Africa is today, 300 years ago. And we are now at a stage where only 1/7 of the world is really in a state of undernourishment. And of that, it's really only a fraction of them who are severely. Even the poorest, one of the poorest countries in the world, Ethiopia, can afford, with donor support, to have a very substantial safety net under its very poorest. Another one of the poorest countries in the world, India, has employment guarantee and is about to have a food distribution. So we, relatively poor countries in Latin America have conditional and unconditional cash transfers that are extremely efficient safety nets for the poorest. To paraphrase that horrible person, Grover Norquist, who said government is, in this case, poverty is small enough now that we can drown it in that way. we can do enough for them if we have the will and the understanding to put our money where I believe our hearts and minds are, in an effective way. I think some of that requires remembering things we once knew but forgot, like the importance of crop breeding for local circumstances, which we don't need new crop varieties here, but they do, and so you have to wrap your head around that problem. Some of these issues are genuinely technologically novel. Okay, so climate change will make the Sahel look like no place on Earth. There is no precedent for the environment that they will be living in. They already have the highest soil temperatures of anywhere on Earth. They will have the highest soil temperatures of any place in history. So, but it's possible to do science for those environments. We just have to get it together to do it. But we can afford to do it for the first time in human history, and the question is, will we?
I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap this up. So just want to say, so right now, you'll see in the next coming months what actually happens in Mali. And so I encourage you guys to keep apprised of that situation. Right now, the Economic Community of West African States is considering whether or not to send in 3,000 troops to stabilize the region in order to allow food aid to flow into the regions where this food security crisis exists. And so you might ask yourself, if you were in this position, what would you do? Is that a good idea? And what are the ramifications of that? And so watch in the following months to see what happens. This is a great debate. I want to thank both of our speakers for taking the time out, and I'll give you guys a few minutes to get to the good seats down in the keynotes. And we also have some gifts for our panel. So I want to give a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much. And I don't know if anyone wanted the slides, but we'll be able to hand the slides. If anybody wanted the slides, I don't know if you guys, we can share them on the website, okay? Thank you.
It's a category of technology